hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil one.
Yours is the kingdom and the power and the glory of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, now and ever, and into ages of ages.
Amen. Okay, hello everybody. Welcome back to those of you who were here last week. So this is the second of 4 planned lectures on the music and hymnography of the church. Last week we talked about the Divine Liturgy, which is our Eucharistic service, and I went over what's in it, why we do it, and some of the people who wrote some of the major prayers and set it out for us. I do want to give a shout out to Nick, who slipped me a copy of the Liturgy of St. James, because we did have a question last week about the Liturgy of St. James. So yes, the Liturgy of St. James, which I didn't discuss last week, is another form of the Divine Liturgy. I got a chance to go through it briefly. It does hit a lot of the same main points. We have readings from the Epistle of the Gospel. We have our little entrance coming out with the Gospel. We have our great entrance coming out with the gifts. We have an anaphora. We have, we take communion. So all of the main points are there. Some of the prayers are a little bit different, and the one that really jumped out to me was what we sing instead of the cherubic hymn. So at the Liturgy of John Chrysostom and of St. Basil, we sing Let Us Who Represent the Cherubim, and we sing the Thrice Holy Hymn, and so forth. At the Liturgy of St. James, we sing a different hymn at that point, which is Let All Mortal Flesh Keep Silence, and that apparently takes the place. You will get a chance to hear that in one of our liturgies coming up if you're here on Holy Saturday. You're going to hear that, so listen for that one. But at this point, starting with this week, I want to move away from basically the music and the prayers that surround things we do, which is like taking communion, baptism, etc. And instead, I want to start focusing on the prayers and the hymns that have to do with teaching, instructing us about the faith, the saints, the feasts, and so forth. And I wanted to kick it off with 2 of the earliest hymnographers we know about who wrote a lot of these instructional hymns. And these would be Ephraim the Syrian, who was in the 4th century, and Romanos the Melodist, who was in the 6th century. With both of these people, we know quite a bit about their lives, and we know that they wrote a great deal, and we still have some of this hymnography, and we still use some of it, so they'd be great people to talk about. But before I get into them, I want to pull back a little bit, and I want to look at why we tend to use music and the creative arts in general, just as human beings, and then why it gets incorporated into our church services. So, one big thing is that music is a really great way to help people remember things, all right? I've got this image here of Maria teaching the Von Trapp children solfege, do, re, mi, right? This is the doe, a deer, a female deer song. She's using music to teach kids about music. To give a couple other examples of this, when I learned the alphabet as a child, I learned it through a song. I learned A, B, C, D, E, F, G. When I was a little older, like 10 or 11, I had to memorize all the states. And I learned that through a song. I learned Alabama, Alaska, Arizona, Arkansas, California, Colorado. Yeah, and that's still in my head decades later. So music can be a very effective way of teaching people things and getting them to remember it. Next thing, music influences emotion. It tells us how to feel about things. And we know this just from how it's used in drama, but we can also see it in our church services. The melodies and the style and the way we sing things during this season, the Lenten season, is markedly different than the way we're going to be singing things when Pascha comes around. The melodies that we sing on Holy Saturday when we're singing the canons, and the melody to the Paschal canon that we sing the next morning, completely different. Again, we know this kind of inherently, but I use this example because first of all, it's one of my favorite movies, but also it uses music quite effectively, and I would argue quite obviously. Does anybody? Yes, you get it, okay. So, this of course was a film that came out in World War II, and not to go over the entire plot here, but basically the crux of this is it's this group of people who are in the city of Casablanca, and they all have to basically make decisions as to, do I want to pursue my own interests, which could be money or, self-preservation or romance or what have you, or do I want to join this larger fight and, get myself involved, even if it's going to cause me to lose things. This, of course, is the ending here, where our heroes basically make the decision that I am going to put aside what I really want, I'm going to sacrifice for the greater good. And my argument would be, it's not just the dialogue that convinces us of this, that the end of the film is kind of this, it's bittersweet, but it's not a heart-wrenching tragedy. It's supposed to be ultimately a story about sacrifice and ultimate triumph, and it's the music that sells that. So music influences emotion. And then, to back up a little bit further, the reason we use poetry and the reason we use the dramatic arts, which is to say, imagining what people in a certain place or time or historical event would say, is it helps us understand what happened. It helps us we put ourselves in the shoes of the people who were there. I chose this because of the day it is today. Today is March 15th, aka the Ides of March. That happened over 2,000 years ago. Julius Caesar was assassinated. But that story has been told again and again and again. And in this case, this is Marlon Brando portraying Mark Antony in a 50s version of Shakespeare's play, Julius Caesar. And so these are ways by creating retellings of events, it helps us to connect ourselves with things that may have occurred a long time ago. So with all of that in mind, Christian hymnographers knew all these things. They knew them inherently as human beings, and they could see that it worked in the pagan world. So they decided, why not use it for the church? And again, a couple of the people I'm talking about today used it extremely effectively, and these were Ephraim the Syrian and Romanos the melodist. So I'm going to go over both of their lives, some of their compositions, and then I'm going to actually hand it over to Christopher at the very end, who is going to help with singing some different settings of Romanos the melodist, and tell us a little bit about what we do, and more importantly, don't know about the way things might have sounded. So, Ephraim the Syrian, also called the Harp of the Spirit, he lived in the 4th century, and he lived in Nisibis, which is now in Turkey, for most of his life. He was a deacon. He was an early form of a monastic. Basically, he was kind of dedicated to the church at an early age, and lived in celibacy there. And he was an extremely prolific author. He wrote hymns, he wrote homilies, he wrote hagiographies, which is saints' lives, and he wrote a number of prayers. There was an invasion by the Persians. They basically overran and sacked the city of Nisibis in 363. So he had to move to Edessa, which is now the city of Urfa. If you look at it on a map today, it's at the very southern border of Turkey, quite close to the Turkish-Syrian border there. And then eventually he reposed in 373 after treating victims of an epidemic. He ended up catching it himself, and he died. His feast is celebrated on January 28th. So, what do we use from him? We use this. This is a very common prayer in Lent. The prayer of St. Ephraim was his. and we say it multiple times during the Lenten services. O Lord and Master of my life, take from me the spirit of sloth, despair, lust of power, and idle talk, but give rather the spirit of chastity, humility, patience, and love to thy servant. Yea, O Lord and King, grant me to see my own transgressions and not to judge my brother, for blessed art thou unto ages of ages. Amen. And this is the main thing we take from Ephraim the Syrian. Now, I understand that actually in Syriac Christian churches, they use a little bit more of his stuff, but this is what we still retain. But that's not all he did, and it's not all we still have. He's called Ephraim the Syrian not just of where he lived, but what language he used to write it. He wrote in a language called Syriac, which actually was just a form of Aramaic. It's a Semitic language and would have been one of the ones that Jesus spoke, right? And he wrote a lot of what they call teaching hymns, or madrasha, if you know any basically Hebrew or Jewish words. You might recognize the term midrash, which is another term for just teaching, especially teaching about a theological subject. We still have about 400 of his hymns. We know he wrote a lot more than that, but we still retain about 400. How did he write? Well, what he liked to do was he liked to have a repeated refrain, which was the main takeaway point, and then he would have all of these different verses. So you'd have your refrain, and then a verse, that refrain again, and then a verse, refrain again, and then a verse, and so forth. And I will read you an example of this. A lot of the time, these would be dialogues, like between two different characters in the Bible, or maybe two different symbolic characters. And these could be sung antiphonally. You could have two different singers doing it, or you could have two different choirs going back and forth. So you could look at this, obviously taught theological concepts, but it also was kind of a form of drama, you know, a dialogue between two different people. And his subjects were really wide-ranging. Sometimes it would be just a straight-up theological argument. He wrote a lot of stuff against Arian Christianity, or different heresies, kind of in defense of Trinitarian Christianity. He also liked a lot of biblical scenes. Sometimes, you know, during the sieges, he wrote a lot of things to console or to inspire people. So he had a lot of different subjects. But to give you an idea, where did my book go? There we go. I'm going to read to you from one of his Nisibin hymns. It's number 36 here. And I'm not going to read the entire thing. It's quite long, but this ought to give you an idea. This is kind of an abridged version here. So this scene is basically death is confronting Christ after Christ has been crucified and gone down into Sheol. So the refrain, and this would be recited between each stanza, is, "Blessed is he who gave me the victory and enlivened the dead to his glory." So death is speaking here. "If thou be God, show thy power, and if thou be man, feel our power. And if it be Adam that thou seekest, get thee hence. Because of his transgressions, he is shut up in here. Who can open the mouth of hell and plunge and bring him up from her, who has swallowed him and keeps a hold on him forever? I am he who has conquered all the wise men, and in the corners they are heaped for me in hell. Come, enter, son of Joseph, and see terrible things, the limbs of the giants, the mighty corpse of Samson, and the skeleton of Goliath." Okay. This goes on, and then we have this very dramatic moment. Death ended his speech in derision, and the voice of our Lord sounded into hell, and he cried aloud and burst the graves one by one, and trembling took hold on death. And then death kind of sinks to his knees. He said, "Be not wroth against me, gracious Jesus, for the words that my pride has spoken before thee. Who is there that when seeing thy cross shall have doubted that thou art man? Who is there that shall have seen thy power and shall not believe that thou art also God? Lo, thus by these two things I have learnt to confess that thou art man and likewise God. O Jesus King, receive my supplication, and with my supplication take to thyself a pledge, even Adam, except for thyself, in him who him in whom are buried all the dead, even as when I received him, in him were hidden all the living. First pledge I have given thee the body of Adam. Go thou therefore and reign over all, and when I shall hear thy trumpet, I with mine own hand will lead forth the dead at thy coming. Right? So obviously very dramatic language here, and the idea that death is speaking, confronting and shrinking before the power of Christ, very, very vivid. So Ephraim loved to write things like that, and obviously they would have been very arresting for the parishioners to hear as well, and I would think quite fun to sing. This is a great question. My guess is that it would have been sometime, my guess, and this is speculation on my part, I'm thinking it would have been during Mass. Just because of what we're going to see with Romanos here in a little while. There's not a lot of room for this in the Divine Liturgy, but Matins, even today, is where we get a lot of this more elaborate singing. And if you go to like a full all-night vigil service with everything included, there's places there where you can put in patristic readings from the different church fathers. There's a lot of didactic readings, lives of saints, so there's a lot of space for things like this in Matins, so I'm going to guess that was when they did it. So we're going to hop forward a couple centuries here to this next hymnographer that we know a lot about. So we don't really have his dates. The only one we can pin down from his life is that we know he was an adult and composing in 555, and he must have died later than that. So that's about all we got. We know he was born in Emesa, which is now the city of Homs in Syria. We're certain that he was aware of and read the compositions of Ephraim. He went through his life, he lived in Beirut for a while, then he went to Constantinople, and he was a reader and a deacon in the big churches in Constantinople. Now, the very important kind of turning point story about his life comes where he was at a feast of the Nativity of our Lord, and he was asked to read something relatively simple. Probably he was asked to read a kathisma, some psalms, and he just did such a terrible job of it that the priest kind of pulled him aside and told him just to sit back down. And he was really distraught over this, and he had a dream or a vision of the Theotokos, who came to him and gave him this scroll and told him to eat it, which he did. There's stories of the Old Testament prophets receiving similar visions. And when he basically woke up, came to himself, he had this beautiful gift for composition and for singing. And the tradition goes on to tell us that this was the service at which he stood up and he sang probably his most famous Kontakion, which is Today the Virgin Gives Birth, the famous Kontakion for Christmas. He was the author of over 1,000 Kontakia. And a Kontakia was not just one stanza in those days, it was a much longer composition. We still have between 60 and 90. The reason we don't know whether it's 60 or 90 is we have 90 that say written by Saint Romanos, but scholars debate over how many were actually written by him and how many were kind of in his style. They're certain about 60 of them. The other 30 they're on the fence about. He's also credited with the composition of the Akathist to the Theotokos, that first Akathist. And then his feast is October the 1st, which also coincides with the Feast of the Protection of the Theotokos, so he's just very closely connected with her. So, his Kontakion, his style. The word Kontakion actually comes from like the stick that a scroll would be wrapped around, and so it gives you an idea of how these were stored and what they kind of physically looked like. Today, a Kontakion is basically one verse with an ekos. But originally they were a lot longer. And like the compositions of Ephraim, you would have a single line that's repeated at the bottom of each of these stanzas. Again, it's the main idea that you keep coming back to. These were often very dramatic retellings from the Bible, from the lives of the saints, To give one example, there's a wonderful story about the woman who bought the jar of ointment and breaks it open and anoints the feet of Christ. He has an entire Kentuckian, which again is multiple verses, where she is kind of outside looking in. She gets inspired, I want to see him, and then she goes to the perfume seller. And she's talking to the perfume seller, and the perfume seller is saying, why are you spending all your money on this? And she describes it, and so it's taking a biblical story, but really imbuing it with a lot of kind of emotion. Today, we really will only sing the first verse, a single verse of the Kentuckian, or if you're doing it in the canon at Matins, you'll do that verse, and then you'll have an ekos, which is another verse that kind of goes along with it. We know these used to be a big part of the Matin service. Apparently, they were quite complicated to sing. The melodies were extremely elaborate. There was one story in late Byzantium where basically your star singer would be the person who would do the Kentuckian, and sometimes he'd get a coin at the end of it. And these got so elaborate and so difficult to do that other hymnographers started writing something simpler, which was what we now have as the Matins canon. The thing is, we still retain that Kentuckian at the absolute middle of the canon, because after we get to the sixth ode, we still sing one verse from the Kentuckian. That's like a lower strata of the hymnography there. And then, of course, we'll also take that Kentuckian and we'll sing it in the Divine Liturgy. Now, if you have the chance to go to a Matin service for Annunciation and listen to the full canon that's read there, not just the sung parts, but the verses in between, I think that's the closest we have today to what a Kentuckian might have sounded like, because the canon for Annunciation is very interesting. The verses, the read parts, are entirely a dialogue, kind of a debate between the Archangel Gabriel and the Virgin Mary, because he comes to her and she says, wait, I'm a virgin, how can I have a child? And then he says, this is why, and she says, I don't know, are you Satan come to deceive me? And it goes back and forth like this. So I think that's the closest approximation we have. Now, before I turn it over to Christopher here, I do want to read a couple of Cantatia by St. Romanos that we still use that are coming up, basically. So this one is from the canon for Palm Sunday. Seated in heaven upon thy throne, and on earth upon a foal, O Christ our God, thou hast accepted the praise of angels and the songs of children who cried out to thee, blessed art thou that comest to call back Adam. And then the ekos, O immortal Lord, thou hast bound hell, slain death, and raised the world. Therefore the children carrying palms sing praise to thee as victor, O Christ, and they cry aloud to thee this day, Hosanna to the Son of David. For no more, say they, shall the little children be slain because of Mary's child, but thou alone art crucified for all, both young and old. No more shall the sword be drawn against us, for thy side is pierced by a spear. With great rejoicing then we cry, blessed art thou that comest to call back Adam. So that's the piece that Romanos composed, and we still maintain. And then, one of my favorites by Romanos that we still use is at the service of the 12 Passion Gospels, which is a Matin service. We have a canon there, and the Kentuckian is, come, let us all sing the praises of him who was crucified for us, for Mary said when she beheld him on the tree, though thou dost endure the cross, yet thou art my son and God. And the ekos, seeing her own lamb led to the slaughter, Mary, his mother, followed him with the other women, and in her grief she cried, where dost thou go, my child? Why dost thou run so swiftly? Is there another wedding in Cana? And art thou hastening there to turn water into wine? Shall I go with thee, my child, or shall I wait for thee? Speak some word to me, O word, and do not pass me by in silence. Thou hast preserved me in virginity, and thou art my son and God. At this point, I want to turn it over to Christopher, who will speak a little bit more to the musical side, and he has prepared some settings of the most famous of the Cantacia of Romanos. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Well, apparently he didn't. I think yours is closer to the idea is that he really could not read. He not that he didn't know what the words meant, but his voice was bad. Yeah, and he couldn't chant. And he really loved music, he loved chanting, he loved the services, but couldn't do it. And yeah, so it wasn't just he had a bad day, it was just that particular day. It was such a big feast. They told him to sit down. It was a really, kind of devastating moment for him. Yeah, yeah. Yes, many, many choirs will have him as a patron saint, or it'll be the St. Romanos choir, St. Romanos festivals, things like that. Yeah, he's considered the singer's saint. I wanted to, before Christopher goes here, I wanted to just give you the text, which is today the Virgin gives birth to the transcendent one, and the earth offers a cave to the unapproachable one. Angels with shepherds glorify him, the wise men journey with a star, since for our sake the pre-eternal God is born as a little child. All yours, darling.
Yeah, all right. I've been preempted because I wanted to read that text as the first thing, but never mind. I'm not used to microphones, I hate them. So I'll suppress the temptation of doing an Elvis impression, which I have done in my time, believe it or not. Although you may think it extremely unlikely, but anyway, I want to sing you 3 musical settings of that text that's just been read, which is the Christmas Cantacion by St. Romanos, the melodist, arguably perhaps his best known work. 3 settings spread over the centuries, gives you a sort of idea of the way that melodies have developed over that time. But before I do that, I think there are some points that really do need to be made, and I've been put on my soapbox this week, so I'm mixing my metaphors now. You can't milk a soapbox, but I'm going to milk it for all it's worth. When I do some contributions later this Lent, I want to keep it much simpler, but I do want to make these points this first time round, that when we're talking about these hymnographers, not just Ephraim the Syrian, not just St. Romanos, but the likes of, really starting in the 4th century, Anatolius of Constantinople, Germanus of Constantinople, Andrew of Crete, John of Damascus, the nun Cassia. Yes, there were lady hymnographers too. They belonged to a time when there was no musical notation used in church at all. At all. So therefore we have absolutely no idea how these things might have sounded. These people were composers in the full sense of the word. They wrote not only the words, but they had melodies in mind, but they had no means of actually notating those melodies. It was completely an oral tradition. It was passed on from one singer to another. So if, as sometimes happens, someone comes along and says, we sing the original melody of this hymn, it's not true. All sorts of different musical traditions have developed since that time. In the Serbian church, we sing things in a very different way, for instance, than the Romanians might do, or the Russians, or the Bulgarians. And then, of course, we share a lot of hymns with those with whom we're no longer in communion, like the Copts, the Armenians, the Ethiopians, and for instance. A whole host of different ways of singing things have developed. My own particular area of interest is the singing of the East Slavs. So we're talking about the Great Russians, the Belarusians, the Ukrainians, the Carpatho-Grossins, and just within that group, there's a huge variety of melodies, different dioceses, different monasteries, different cathedrals. They all have their own different ways of singing things. So it's not true that there is some universal melody. If you ever hear somebody suggest, oh, we universally use a melody. No, there isn't a single hymn in the entire church that is sung the same way throughout the entire church. Okay. So, tantalizingly, if we go right back, the earliest notated hymn actually belongs probably before the end of the 3rd century, and it's included in a fragment called the Oxyrhynchus. Okay, which was discovered in Egypt. And it's a hymn to the Trinity. And we're talking about something that is little more than 200 years after the life of Christ. And it is fully musically notated. It's a musical notation that belongs to the late Hellenic period. So we're talking about the ancient Greeks, and we can actually read that. Before the end of the 3rd, yeah, so 200 and something, yeah. It really is unique. Christians didn't continue to use that form of notation. They abandoned it, and they really didn't invent their own form for another something like 650 years. Really the only form of musical notation for singing hymns came about in probably the middle of the 10th century. No, I'm really talking about sort of Byzantine notation. Yes. That's yeah. So, in regards to this particular hymn, the Troparion for the Kontakion for Christmas, we do have some manuscripts from Russia, early ones, and they are written in a unique notational system called Kondakarian notation. And there are only, I think, 5 collections still in existence of this, plus a few fragments and plus a few odd works that are included in other things. and it's a notation that isn't used anymore. And up until recently, it was considered to be undecipherable, but some clever musicologists have attempted to decipher it. It's not just guesswork. I mean, a lot of sort of research has gone into it. It's comparison with other manuscripts, with some of the very few surviving Greek ones that use a notation that is somewhat alike. So what you see here is an attempted reconstruction of that Kondakarian notation. If you look carefully, each of the notes has a symbol over it. That's the lower level. I put those in by hand, well, on a mouse pad, which is the closest one gets to doing things by hand these days. And then there's a second row above it, the bigger ones. I gave that task to Martha. They're the so-called great hypostases. And at one time they were considered to be some sort of indication of the performer's practice, the means by which things would be sung. But I think scholars are now coming round to the idea that actually they represent, there's a sort of shorthand representing particular musical patterns. And this, anyway, this reconstruction that's, in the modern musical notation, it was done about, I don't know, 25 years ago by a Russian lady musicologist called Pozhedayeva. So, I've talked enough. I need to sing now, but somebody needs to hold this for a moment while I get a note. I should add, those of you who can read Slavonic, this is very much Old Church Slavonic. So what we now call the hard sign and the soft sign, for instance, nowadays they just affect the consonant that immediately precedes them. In those days, they were actually pronounced as half vowels, so they formed syllables of their own right. And they're also so-called nasal vowels. The character called the malayes, for instance, which nowadays is pronounced as ya, was in those days more like the vowel that you get in the French word fin. So it's an sort of sound. So this is going to be a great challenge for me to do this. This belongs to either the very end of the 11th century or the beginning of the 12th century, so round about 1100, as I put there. Okay. I've now lost my note. That's about a tenth of the hymn. You'll be pleased to know. because I've gone on far too long already. During one of my sleepless nights over the last week, the computer decided to say, no, I've had enough. I'm doing the first page, but not doing any more. That's it. So, thank heaven for small mercies. One more thing, which has now gone out of my head. I had it there a moment ago. Maybe it'll come to me. I can't remember. No, never mind. Couldn't have been that important. Let's move on. So that was Condacarian notation. As I say, it's not used anymore. It completely fell out of practice. I don't think we have any. By the time we get to the 14th century, there are no longer there's anything that's written in that notation. So we can go on to the next one. That was the first. Only 3, remember. So then they had to fall back in Russia on znameny chant. Because the Condacarian style of singing had disappeared, it sort of left a gap. And hymns like Troparia and Cantakia then came to be simply read in church with just the final line, which was repeated and sung. So this time, I actually can read the kryoki, the znameny notation. So the thing would be read through, and then the final line would be repeated to a melody. Today the Virgin gives birth to the transcendent one, and the earth offers a cave to the unapproachable one. Angels with shepherds glorify him, the wise men journey with a star, since for our sake the pre-eternal God is born as a little child. Since for our sake the pre-eternal God is born as a little child. That melody of that last line actually jumping even further forward to the middle of the 17th century. Since for our sake the pre-eternal God is born as a little child. Those of you who are familiar with the Russian New Rite, that's one of the forms of melody in znameny chant that Prokimena use. That's how it's passed down to us now. So it left something of a gap in the repertoire until the sort of late flowering of znameny chant, when we get the so-called great chant, which is very, very florid, very melismatic, by which I mean lots of notes to a single syllable. But the use of that was rather restricted in that you had to have good singers and able to do it, good trained singers, so it was only really major churches. But then you come to the middle of the 17th century, and all sorts of things happened in Russia at that time with regard to the church. There was Patriarch Nikon, who changed the liturgical books. That led to the schism of the older believers. there were also new musical repertoires that came in, mostly from southwestern Rus, what we now call eastern Ukraine. Muscovy had recently annexed that part of the world. So there was those influences coming in. New repertoires like Kievan chant, which came from basically what is now eastern Ukraine. The so-called Greek chant, which I think scholars now agree was the result of some Greek singers visiting Russia and Russian musicians trying to notate what the Greeks were singing, but Russifying things in the process. And then also Bulgarian chant, which completely baffles the scholars because it seems to have nothing in common with the way that the Bulgarian church sings things. But that also came from southwestern Rus. So this is my final one. Today the Virgin gives birth to the transcendent One, and the earth offers a cave to the unapproachable One. Angels with shepherds glorify Him. The wise men journey with a star, since for our sake the pre-eternal God is born as a little child. I've now remembered what I forgot about 5 minutes ago. That is this particular hymn by St. Romanos, the Cantacion for Christmas, belongs to a variety of hymns called in Greek. In Greek it would be called an aftomelon. In Slavonic it would be samopodobion, which sort of literally means after its own likeness. And that means it's a hymn that serves as a model for other hymns, so that in the original Greek, the same sort of meter would have been used by other composers so that they could use the same melody as the original. And such a derivative hymn would be called in Slavonic a podobion, after the likeness of something. So that is why the first of my three was actually the Troparion for St. Nicholas, not that for Christmas, because we don't, as far as I know, actually have a notated in Condacarian notation, a copy of the original Christmas Cantacion. So I've done my bit, but there is one more slide, and because this is a Serbian church, I don't want to stick my neck out because I'm not that familiar with Serbian chant. I might have to ask for a volunteer to try and sort of eyeing up Milan here for putting you on the spot. This is wonderful. I know enough about Serbian chant to have noticed that there is a mistake. Top left-hand corner, it says tone 4. It's not tone 4, it's tone 3, which is what all the liturgical books say it should be, and I can recognize that that is not tone 4, that's tone 3. Also, I've tried to stick with the same translation for all these examples. There is one tiny omission, that is the prefix for the word pre-eternal. The pre is missing there, but do you think you could give it a go? Okay.
Today the Virgin gives birth to the transcendent one, and the earth offers a cave to the unapproachable one. Angels with shepherds glorify him. The wise men journey with a star, since for our sake the pre-eternal God is born as a little child.
I've done my bit. Next week will be much shorter. I'll just sing 2 things, I think, and leave it at that. So thank you for your patience.
And just to wrap it up, for next week, the topic will be some of the later hymnographers of Byzantium, which will be John of Damascus, his brother Cosma, and Cassiani, the nun. And then the week after that, we're going to do Andrew of Crete and the Lenten Triodion. And then we will have other things to worry about, namely Holy Week, Palm Sunday, and Pascha. So thank you very much.